Hello, so this is going to be a video on the Yugoslav or the Serbian M2 mask. Now, there's a couple of variants to this. For example, one of them has a voice emitter similar to the sort of third version of the Finnish M61 on it, but this isn't that variant. I previously had done a video on this and I tested it and it worked alright for what it was. But the issue was YouTube at one point sort of had a ban-happy algorithm on a lot of Yugoslavian stuff, which I won't go too much into on this video. So as a result, I took a lot of videos down on Yugoslav and like Serbian gear, especially stuff from around the 90s, in case, they were being, you'd get more strikes on it for that sort of thing. So anyway, here's essentially a re-upload of it. So this is quite an interesting mask, because some of you will obviously recognise the shape of this, although it's a lot more trimmed down and neat. So before this, the Serbs had, or Yugoslavian I should say at this point, had, I think it was called, is it the M51? And the M51, or it might have been the M59, was basically a US M1, M1, I think probably, sorry, not an M1, M9, sorry, yep, beg my pardon, US M9A1, I think it was. It was basically a direct copy of it, but just made from much lower quality rubber. They had a habit of mounting, which I think this mask might still have, but this one's been perfectly fine. And they had that for most of the Yugoslav period. But then into the 90s, which again, is the time when everything went bad for Yugoslavia, they ended up upgrading it, so you can either call this the Yugoslavian or the Serbian M2, but they went from the M1, which was the M9 copy, to the M2. And what this is, fundamentally, as you can see, is an M9 but shrunk down, so without the comically big nose. So the, eyepieces look much bigger on the face blank compared to everything else, and the XL valve does. But it's also 40mm NATO, so it's actually really cool, because what they've essentially done is just done a very simple upgrade. So it's not obviously the same face piece, but it's inspired by the same face piece. So hopefully there, you can see that it is essentially what would happen if you shrunk down an M9. So as a result, it's a lighter weight mask that sits closer to your face. You've not got the comically big nose on the front. The reason the nose is really big on the M9 is because you've basically got the Tissot tube system runs through the nose, and then you've also got the big oral nasal cup in there. With this one, I don't think you have such a big Tissot system at all. I'm just seeing if I can see it in there. But yeah, I think the Tissot system on this only comes out on the eyepiece on that side. Yeah, and then just uses the oral nasal cup. Yeah, so it's a good mask for what it is. I won't bother putting it onto this video. The other interesting thing of this is they used 40mm NATO filters. So when they used the M9 clone, they kept it in 60mm NATO. Even though, bear in mind, Yugoslavia, it was a communist country. It was not either Warsaw Pact or NATO. They sort of were neutral and had a good army, so, nobody messed with them, essentially. But they weren't, they bought equipment from both sides. They had some indigenous design stuff. So this was one of the bits of equipment where, they went for a, basically a NATO sort of copy thing. So what they decided at obviously some point was that they wanted to actually go to 40mm, not 60mm masks, and this is what they came up with. And obviously you can see from this that if you had a 60mm port on here, it'd be far too big on the side. But I just particularly find this mask interesting because although the Serbian M3 is much closer to just a copy of a US M40, this one is kind of interesting because they've at least done their own thing with it. As in, rather than just copying a mask or doing a cheap copy of a mask, because obviously, while the Yugoslavian M1 was nowhere near as good as, say, like the Finnish M61, it wasn't a good copy of the M9, and then you've got even better, copies or clones of the M9, like the Finnish M61, which is made to a much higher standard, much better rubber, much better straps and everything. This thing is at least interesting, because the durability and quality of it seems a lot better than the M1, at least. But, it's interesting because they at least did their own thing with it. They didn't just keep the M1 design or the M9 sort of design, and then go straight to a new mask that they copied from somewhere else, in the 90s or whatever to maybe 2010, whenever it was that they were using this style mask. Although, again, there's a version of a voice emitter on the front, sort of a voice diaphragm, a bit like the Finns did as well. For the most part, this is interesting because it's at least a semi-indigenous design, in the sense that even if it's originally based on another mask, it's clearly not that mask anymore.